NOVAsia magazine had the privilege to sit down and discuss with journalist and political analyst Negar Mortazavi regarding the challenges of covering political affairs in the Middle East and foreign policy in the United States. Our team got the opportunity to hear her valuable input on the political situation in Iran over a year after the death of Mahsa Jina Amini, which led to mass protests in the country. Due to your work as a journalist and political analyst, you have built a platform of discussion by participating in various panels and by creating your own podcast called Iran Podcast. What initially sparked your interest for this line of work, and what keeps you engaged to pursue this field?
So I've always been interested in journalism. I actually started in middle school as a teenager. There was a student paper, a national newspaper in Iran for young adults. It was called Aftab or the Sunflower. And I used to write for them, and they picked a group of young journalists, as they call them, honorary journalists. I was one of them nationwide in Iran. That's how I got into it. I've always been interested in telling stories and also observing the world from various perspectives. I always like to put myself in people's shoes. Why do they do things? What is the thinking? What is the logic? There must be an understanding. I'm interested in cultures and diversity and how different people in different parts of the world do things differently, but also I'm interested in the similarities. And I feel like at the end of the day, we're all so similar than different. And if you understand where the other person is coming from, what the thinking is, what the environment is, what the thought process is, what the history, the background, the legacy that's behind doing things differently, that can give you an opportunity to understand or appreciate how they see life differently, how they approach it. So I think that goes to the core of my work as a journalist, as we call it, being objective or fair, to try to look at the various different sides. I feel like we need a lot more of that in our world, and I'm just hoping that I can contribute to that, especially because the field that I cover, I focus on, the political field, is such a polarized and difficult field to understand for the average person. So I'm hoping to bring that kind of understanding to a more mainstream audience and not simplify, but explain things that are sometimes very bizarre and weird for people to understand.
Being openly discussing political matters in the media, especially as a woman, does bring some risks to be targeted by certain individuals. How are you and your colleagues addressing those situations? Do you feel there is enough support given in such cases, or is there a lack that should be worked on to ensure a more secure work environment?
Well, first of all, I want to say it's still a man's world. And then that pertains to certain industries. The media industry is still fairly male dominated, especially when you get in particular areas like politics, like foreign policy, the area that I'm covering, Iranian politics, US Iran relations, US foreign politics. And it's a very polarized field. We're talking about these big, powerful countries that are essentially fighting each other. They may go to war, there's conflict. So it's a very sensitive field with high stakes for a lot of governments, interest groups, people. And stepping into that field comes with a lot of challenges, especially as a woman of color, as a person with a fairly younger age compared to a lot of other peers who do this kind of work, older male, the old guards who've been covering this field as both a journalist and also an analyst. A lot of times people get surprised when they see me, the way I look, as showing up for the analysis of this certain topic because they're used to a specific profile which I don't fit in any way. Nevertheless, experience and the understanding and the expertise I bring to the field has helped me come and arrive to the position that I have, but also it's brought a lot of challenges. It's brought a lot of even threats for my work, for my safety. There is a lot of online harassment against women journalists, against analysts, particularly in these certain fields. You know, the industry tries to push you to cover women's issues, to cover culture, to cover society, covering politics, covering contentious areas of politics, foreign policy in the US or the Iranian politics. These are all very difficult and very challenging, and the targeting of women is something that's very serious in this field. So I have unfortunately been one of the main targets of the harassment against journalists, against women journalists or analysts of a certain view, especially if you try to bring nuance to these polarized stories, if you try to be fair or objective. When I'm talking about Iran and US tensions, anytime that I cover or say something that sounds like one of the two sides would be sympathetic to it, the other side would attack you as spewing propaganda for the other. So it's been challenging. It's caused a lot of stress, safety issues for myself, for my loved ones, my family. From the Iranian perspective, I actually have been living in exile. I can't return back to Iran because the government doesn't like my way of working, my coverage as a journalist, covering, freely with the news analysis. And then certain interest groups also outside Iran don't like my work because I try to bring nuance and be objective. And sometimes they accuse me of being too sympathetic to the Iranian regime, while the Iranian regime also thinks I'm too sympathetic to the other side. I have been called a CIA agent and a regime agent sometimes on the same day. And this is not just my experience. A lot of other journalists who cover this field have been subjected to the same accusations, disinformation, and harassment. And the way this cycle works is that first it starts with smears and disinformation. And then when the public starts to believe these smear stories and the disinformation that these journalists are working for this or that, or sympathetic to this or sympathetic to that, then it escalates into threats, into violent sexual language against women, especially, and then threats of safety against ourselves and our family. Last year, I had a panel at the University of Chicago in the US, and there's a massive harassment campaign launched to try to get the panel canceled, and eventually a bomb threat was sent to the university via an anonymous email. So the threats against journalists are very high, and we don't get the kind of protection that, for example, politicians get. We don't get safety, security protections. Law enforcement is not very aware of the kind of threats that we face. The online threat environment is still new, is still developing, is not taken seriously by law enforcement. And even the audience, I think, is not aware. A lot of times when I talk about these threats that are against me, they would say, "Oh, you're using the gender card." This is something I hear a lot. You're just a bad journalist, but you're using a gender card. Well, it is a gender issue if there's sexualized, violent language directed, specifically targeting women. But it's something that even the audience doesn't see the full landscape, and it's hard to describe and explain it. And especially as a journalist, inserting yourself into the story is not something we usually do. It's hard for me to cover things that are happening to myself. So we have to rely on other journalists who focus on this field, the field of disinformation, the field of online violence, which is not my field, to try to tell our stories. And that's also a little bit difficult to get the attention of those who cover those fields. So overall, there are a lot of challenges. But at the same time, I love my job. I'm very passionate about what I do. I think I'm good at what I do. And there aren't so many people with these skill sets. There are very few Iranian Americans, the small group that are doing this as standing on a bridge with access and view of two sides that are completely disconnected. It's very difficult for Iranian journalists inside Iran to come to the US, to understand the US, to cover to the US, even travel or access average Americans. And it's also difficult for American journalists to travel to Iran. They're not allowed to access Iranians. Language is difficult. There's a very serious language barrier. Culture is hard to understand. The country has been isolated. It's like a black box. So I think media can be very helpful in serving, in providing information and understanding, but there's very limited opportunities and openings for the two sides to understand and cover each other. So I'm hoping that I can contribute with my work to that. I'm very passionate about it. So the threats are stressful and are concerning, but it hasn't stopped me.
September 16, 2023 marked the one-year anniversary of the 22-year-old Mahsa Jina Amini's death in custody after being arrested by the morality police. For viewers who are unfamiliar with Iran's socio-political context, Why did this event raise such a strong response in the form of mass protests?
Mahsa Jina Amini, her Kurdish name, was a small town Kurdish girl who was visiting the capital, Tehran. No one had heard of her. She wasn't political. She wasn't famous. Just happened to be in the wrong time, at the wrong place, detained by the morality police for the way she was dressed, taken to the detention center, and essentially died in custody or killed, as her family believes. The spark of the mass protests connects back to 4 decades of resistance by women and girls in Iran against this mandatory hijab, this one specific reading of the religion or a religious virtue, how a woman should dress modestly, that even some Islamic scholars challenge of what is exactly this modesty, and should the state even be in a position to enforce something that's faith onto the citizens. So women in Iran have been fighting this law for 4 decades, slowly pushing back the limits of the mandatory hijab. But I think the killing of Mahsa Amini, the death in custody, was a watershed moment that essentially this violence against women in the form of the morality police, this public harassment against women was taken to the next level. Now a woman died because of how she was dressed. And I think the country showed up for her to say, enough is enough. You can't, you've been subjecting us to violence, to harassment, to, loss of opportunities and job, education, and now you killed someone because of how she was dressed, and enough is enough. It was a watershed moment, and it also changed the course of the Iranian society, essentially giving women the opportunity to make a massive leap in continuation of those 4 decades of protests. Now you see women and girls coming to the public spaces in Iran without the mandatory hijab, being brave, courageous, and defying the hijab in massive numbers. The Iranian society in the public space looks nothing like what it did a year before. And I don't think we're going back to before September of 2022. I like to call it a cultural revolution. Essentially, the face of the Iranian public has completely changed. The regime has not been able to sustain that kind of ruling or forcing of the mandatory hijab. It also, the protests were nationwide. They became very political. People have political, economic, social grievances, and the government has not been able to address them. So the anger keeps piling up and the grievances pile up, and we see protesters coming to the streets.
What was the response of the international community to the events, but also how can individuals show their support to Iranian people?
I think the international community noticed the protests in Iran thanks to, in part, to social media, to videos and images that were shared. A lot of Iranians who were brave to share the stories, the protesters, and then also journalists, the brave journalists inside Iran who take a lot of risk for doing their job. So I'm talking about the challenges of my job here. When you are working on the ground in a country like Iran, the challenges are tremendous. You also face arrest by the government. You can be detained for your work. You can sometimes lose your license to work. And in this case of Mahsa Amini, ironically, the two journalists who first covered it were actually women, young women. One of them went to the hospital where she was in a coma, and she shared Mahsa's story initially on Twitter. Her name is Niloufar Hamedi. The other journalist, Elaheh Mohammadi, went to Mahsa Amini's funeral to cover the funeral and then the protests that followed. And both of them were arrested, were detained, charged with serious charges of espionage, working for foreign governments, similar to the stories that I was saying that, oh, this is a foreign intervention. America or other hostile governments are trying to cause national security issues in the country, and these journalists are working for them. And that's why they covered the story. To this day, they're still going through detention and court proceedings a year after. And it's a testament to how difficult it is and how important, but also very difficult and challenging to cover these stories on the ground, and how women journalists are bravely taking these stories. I think the international community has noticed the Iranians. There's been a lot of solidarity by movements, by feminists, by celebrities, international figures who have brought attention to what's happening inside Iran. There has been sympathetic statements by governments. There have also been some concrete steps. For example, the US government eased some restrictions on internet and technology because of US sanctions against Iran, ironically, US sanctions also limit the use of internet for Iranian users, who are also subject to a lot of filtering and bans by their own government. So some restrictions were eased so that Iranians could use internet and online technology more freely. That was helpful. Solidarity and taking notice, covering the story, keeping their stories alive, and shedding light on what's going on inside Iran. And maybe also some sisterhood or solidarity with the feminist movements, the women's movements outside Iran. Because one thing that's happened to the Iranian civil society because of the political tensions between Iran and the West, Iran has been isolated from the West and the other parts of the world. And the Iranian civil society has been very isolated. They don't have access to a lot of these other countries, neighboring countries, or other parts of the world for travel, for communication, for understanding how movements are unfolding in other countries, and to connect to these other movements. So any form of outreach and connection and solidarity would be helpful to the Iranian civil society and the activists that are working on the ground.
According to you, what is the role of the Iranian diaspora in those protests?
The Iranian diaspora has been very active and very vocal in showing support and solidarity to the protesters inside Iran. They live mostly in safety outside the country. They don't fear arrest or detention like the protesters inside the country. Protesting inside Iran could also get you killed. You put your life at risk. About 500 protesters have been documented by human rights organizations that were killed during the course of the past year. So the diaspora uses that kind of safety and this shield to come out, echo the voices of the protesters inside Iran, show solidarity, bring attention, be present in the media, and essentially serve as that bridge to connect the protesters to the outside world. There have been many protests in cities across the world, mostly attended and organized by the Iranian diaspora, lots of attention in the media, and just telling the stories. There's also divisions in the diaspora, which is unfortunate. There's a lot of infighting among the political factions in the diaspora. There are various opposition groups with political agendas, but that's not the majority of the Iranian diaspora. The majority of the Iranian diaspora are actually not involved in politics as a job. They're engineers, doctors, artists, and but nevertheless they are passionate enough to show up for support, for solidarity, and that's the core of what we see in these protests. The majority essentially just showing up to be a voice and to echo. But we also hear about the infighting of the various different factions, which is a byproduct of the diaspora.
Where does Iran stand 1 year after the incident? Is the Women Life Freedom movement still alive?
I think 1 year after the protest, we know that dissent is still there. At the same time, the government, the state, or the regime used a lot of violence and brutality to crack down on the protests. So we saw a lot of people going back home. It doesn't mean that the anger and the dissent is no longer there. It just means that protesting is very dangerous and risky. So we don't see mass protests or street protests in that sense sustained anymore. But if another spark happens, another incident, another watershed moment, we could very well see people pouring back into the street, which is something we have seen in intervals in the past few years. As far as what the movement achieved, it was nothing short of a cultural revolution because hijab is a matter of the state and politics, but it's also a cultural issue. Iran is a religious country, it's a traditional society, and majority are Muslim. So this dress code goes back to a history of how religion and tradition is viewed. But in the modern society, the newer generation has new readings of how they want to live about their lives. So I think this cultural revolution wasn't just between the society and the state, but it's also in the relationship within various segments of the society. For example, there was an interesting campaign online in the past year launched by women who observe the hijab. So religious women who choose to wear the hijab, but they were saying, I am hijabi, but I don't support the morality police, which means I don't support forcing my belief on someone else who chooses not to wear the hijab. So it's a matter of choice. It's a matter of having that freedom to choose the bodily autonomy. And also, don't do this violence in my name. Don't go around because that's what the state argues, is that, oh, this is what the society wants, this is what women want, this is what the majority of Iranians want. It's a law, it's how we live our life, it's the rule of the land. And essentially these religious communities are saying, no, this is faith-based, and it's something that we choose, but we don't believe it should be forced on others. So I think those dynamics within the society have also changed with the generational change within the modern society, and it's a big achievement that I think essentially the genie is out of the bottle, and women were able to break a leaking dam, and now water's flowing, and the state is trying to put that dam back together, but I don't think they can.
Lastly, as a woman taking a forefront position for freedom of speech through your line of work, what would you like to say to young women aspiring to advance the cause of freedom of speech and women's rights?
I think more women should come into this field, should try to tell stories. If they're passionate about this line of work, should pursue it. Yes, it's challenging, it's risky, but also the more we have people and diverse views, the more diversely we can understand our world. I think it really matters who is telling the story. I believe in diversity in all fields, including the storytelling field, because you bring your perspective. No matter how professional you are, no matter how equal the education is, each person brings a different perspective and sees the world from their own viewpoint. And we need these various different viewpoints to be able to see the world in a more full and complete way. So I think we need more diverse groups of people, more women, younger people, people of color, of different cultures, different experiences, to be able to understand our world and tell the stories of our world. And I think the media field has really evolved. Now it's a more progressive viewpoint on who is a journalist, who can be the storytelling. It's no longer just the old guard parachuting the same journalists into every country. I think there's more attempt within the industry, but it's still not enough. And so the more people who are interested and passionate to enter this field, the more opportunities would be there for the field to diversify and then eventually to tell the stories of this world in a more complete way.